seated. This morning, I want to do just a small recap of what we talked about last Sunday. And we've been kind of going on a little bit of a series here, and I can't take credit for this. My wife gets the credit for this. But as I was going through this series on discipleship for the last couple of Sundays, we landed on a couple of things that we as disciples are supposed to do. We talked about going as disciples to go and share the news. We talked about praying as Jesus prayed, and we also talked about serving as Jesus served. Unbeknownst to me, this was a complete accident that it just wound up to be that those were the initial or the acronym GPS. I didn't realize that. My wife said, "Like that's GPS. Do you know that?" I'm like, "Oh, that is GPS." So if you are looking on things to do each and every day, a handy little acronym, anybody can remember this, is GPS, go, pray, and serve, that we are called to do as disciples of Christ. And so last week we took the idea of service, and then we went and explored a little bit of the idea of Christian service in the form of Christian leadership within the church. And we talked about why do we actually need leaders in the church. And we rewound back to 1st century AD to look at the needs of the early church and why they needed leaders to begin with. What was the reasons behind why they had to establish leaders over the early church there in the 1st century? And so we looked at the ideas of, with a growing church that was there in the 1st century, we have thousands and thousands of people being added to the early church. You had a growing and diverse body. So you had to address the issues that came along with that as well too. So we talked about the ideas of, with this growing body, you needed to keep the unity of the body, but to be able to handle the diversity of the body as well too. We also had to work on the idea with the 1st century church that you had to have a unity of beliefs too that tied the body together so that we didn't have a bunch of heresies and false teachings that would creep in the church and then have a whole bunch of offshoots that was or splinters that was happening within the church as well. And so there was areas where we had disputes that would arise in the church that we needed leaders to come and help settle those disputes, but also to protect the flock and to care for the flock as more needs were added to the body each and every day, year after year there with the growing church. And then we did a little bit of a rewind and looked at the Old Testament and how Israel had leaders set up within their nation as well. And we looked kind of at a little bit of a historical view of Israel throughout the Old Testament, the good leaders that they had, and also the not so good leaders that they had. Whenever we looked at Ezekiel chapter 34, with where Ezekiel calls out the quote unquote bad shepherds of Israel and how they were not doing a good job leading the nation of Israel that was there too. And then last week we ended on the idea of Jesus being the model shepherd, the model leader of the church that we see that was prophesied about in the Old Testament, but then also we see it was fulfilled in the New Testament where Jesus calls himself the good shepherd in John chapter 10. And then we see other authors in the New Testament that calls Jesus the chief shepherd or the great shepherd as well, that was there. So we stopped there for a little bit on the idea of why do we need leaders in the church, and looked at a couple of examples of good leaders and bad leaders. Now I want to take a little bit of a deeper dive just into the New Testament this morning on the 1st century early church that was there. So this is probably going to be a bit more technical than sometimes we see on Sunday morning, but I'm praying and hoping that you're going to get something out of it this morning with this, to look at the structure of the leadership that the early church put in place, and then also look at what the actual official roles of the leaders were in the early church at that time, and then also look at how that applies to us today as leaders in the church, as servants in the church as well too. So let's jump into this morning with the structure of the early church that was there, and look at the task of the leaders that was appointed in the early church that was there. We talked a little bit, there's going to be a little bit overlap from last week, but we want to give it the context of the early church that was there, the 1st century church. Well, this could probably actually go for a couple centuries for the early church until it kind of until it became centered in Rome. We'll say this, so pre-Rome and pre-Pope, we'll say it that way, that was there. So the early leaders of the church was tasked with simply just equipping the early church and building up the early church that was there too. A lot of what we talked about, keeping the unity of the church, making sure that we were consolidated around a common set, a core set of beliefs that was there in the early church, but then also to, as we looked at in Acts chapter 15, settle the disputes that might happen with the diversity of the body, with the Gentiles and the Jewish believers coming together that's there, but then also the growing of the flock. You needed some protection and care to meet the needs that was there. So Jesus demonstrated this task by discipling the early followers that was there following after him. He took the time to teach the disciples. We see all through the New Testament, all through the Gospels, Jesus is sharing with the disciples, teaching moments that's there through parables, through stories, but also just Sermon on the Mount type stuff that's there as well. Jesus took the time as a leader to equip his followers to know the things that he was trying to teach, the points he was trying to get across, and then also expecting them to be able to repeat that and to share that to others around that wasn't following him at that time, to go and make more disciples as the Great Commission had called us to do, or has called all believers to do that's there. So the task of the leaders in the early church was to do that, to basically embody or emulate the very same things that Jesus did with his disciples in the Gospels, to teach them these core teachings that's there too. And the mentality of the teachers was as such as what Jesus embodied as well, where Jesus tells us that in Matthew chapter 20, verse 28, he says that I didn't come to be served, but I came to serve. And so as we take our ideas from Jesus, we take what Jesus actually did, and we apply that as leaders. They understood that their authority was in the context of service of the body. Not that there was something, their authority was something to lord over, but it was in the context of I'm here to serve you as a leader. And so part of being a servant in that way is being responsive to the needs of those that you're serving. Not trying to supplant your ideas for something that might not actually be helpful to the body that's there. And so the early church leaders needed to understand their authority was in the context of serving a specific body. Not something that was pie in the sky or generalized. It was rather specific to whom they were over at that time. And in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 2, it even says that, as Peter is saying to the leaders of the church, that you need to be willing to serve. Not done through compulsion. Well, I guess I have to. Someone's going to make me do it. Might as well go ahead and do it. No, the leaders needed to be willing to do that. It's much easier to lead somebody when you actually want to do it versus being forced to do it. I'm forced to take out the trash every week. I don't like to do it. I have to do it, but I do it begrudgingly. Okay, you can't serve a body begrudgingly. You have to serve willingly as one of the core characteristics that a leader should have that Peter outlines there in 1 Peter chapter 5. So those were the things that we see the mentality of the early church leaders, what they needed to do. And as we look through the New Testament that's there, we see that there is a clear distinction between two official offices of the church at the time. You have what I'm going to call, I put in quotation marks in the outline there, the elders, and then you have the deacons. Two offices that was established in the early church at that time that was there. And we see this outlined in 1 Timothy chapter 3. We're going to get to 1 Timothy chapter 3 here in a minute. But those are the two that's there to see that how they established the leaders in the church and the roles that was there. We're going to get into those more specifically here in a minute. But I do want to take a note here just for a second on those two terms, elders and deacons. Okay. I want us to get in the context of the idea that these are labels that was used by the early church, the first century church. So therefore, these terms may not reflect the roles that correspond to those labels that we have today in the church. Okay? That term deacon looked totally different than the term deacon in the first century. or they used it differently in the first century than we might use it today. So whenever we say deacon today, that's a different deacon than first century Christianity. So I just want to make sure that we don't say, well, Pastor Brandon said this and this about, let's stick with what the Scriptures has. And then maybe we can do some correlations or connections to what we are to do in the 21st century here. So just want to make a note about that. A deacon and the elder in the first century church was different than what it might have been today, or how those roles are performed today as well too. So the Bible uses these terms, elders and deacons. It's important to discuss what those terms are, but then also too, it's important for us to reflect on what they did and also what leaders should be doing today as well, if it matches up with some of those rules that's there too. So I just want to take a quick note on the semantics there of using these specific terms might not necessarily be the terms that we have for the roles that are provided in the church leadership today that's there too. So that's kind of like your little bit of a warning that's there too. So nobody hopefully gets too upset if I share something and say, well, that's not what I do and I'm this person in the church. I'm not saying that's not what you're supposed to be doing. We're just sticking with what the first century church did this morning. So, okay, there we go. There's that little warning to begin with. Let's begin with the elders this morning in 1 Timothy chapter 3. 1 Timothy chapter 3. I'm going to read verses 1 through 7 here this morning. 1 Timothy chapter 3. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, this is a pretty concise division that you see between the two offices of elders and deacons. Verses 1 through 7 is all speaking of the elders of the church. And then after you get to verse 8, it begins to speak about the deacons. So we have a classification of the two offices here within the church, the early church that's there. Beginning at verse 1 here of 1 Timothy chapter 3. This is what Paul is writing to Timothy about. He says, "Here is a trustworthy saying, if anyone sets his heart on being an overseer," we'll get to that term here in a minute, "he desires a noble task. Now the overseer must be above reproach, the husband of but one wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him with proper respect." I guess that maybe puts me out of being an elder in the church. "If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may be conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders, so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap." So we'll stop there for a moment and talk about this idea of elders in the church. Now, if you notice, that was the New International Version of that. If you noticed, the word elder is actually not even being used in that passage to begin with. And the word elder in the Greek is not used in that passage either. So it's not even a translation sidestep either where we can use it. The word elder in the Greek is where we get our word Presbyterian from. Presbyteros is the Greek term for elder in the New Testament that's there. But in the New Testament, we see some of these Greek terms being used interchangeably when you talk about who is an elder in the church. Sometimes elders in the church are just referred to as elder. Sometimes they are referred to as overseer, as we see here in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Sometimes they're referred to as a shepherd. Sometimes they even translate it as the word bishop as well. All of these terms are used interchangeably for someone that's doing the same exact thing. They just might have different terms that they use from there. There's usually just 3 Greek terms that mean basically the same thing. And we'll talk about how they're actually used interchangeably in the scriptures, where they'll use one word in one sentence, and then the very next sentence they use a different word in the Greek for the same exact role that's happening that's there. So don't get too caught up on that that's there. For the term elders that's there, we see the term elders primarily come up in Titus chapter 1, verses 5 through 9, and also in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. Those are where the terms elders are being used, but the same terms as being used in those two passages also correlate to the terms that's here in 1 Peter chapter 3 as well. So those are the 3 big chapters that we look at when we look at the idea of the duties of the early church that's there. So elders. In the Greek just basically means a mature man having seasoned judgment. A mature man having seasoned judgment in the Greek. And that's from 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1, you get the term elder, and then also Titus chapter 1, verse 5 as well. These men were appointed to oversee the congregations, and that's what Paul told Titus to do in Titus chapter 1, that he kind of was like, I'm in a hurry, I got to leave, but I'm going to let you behind, Titus, and you got to set up these guys to help organize the church. He says, I need you to appoint elders over the church that's there too. But they were involved with the spiritual work and administrative work of the congregations there that they were appointed over. And these positions required wisdom, maturity, and most importantly, a strong faith as well. They had to be well-founded in doctrine so that they could repel false teachings, but also be able to repeat a good doctrine to those that was underneath them in the body as well that was there. So the early church adopted this structure of the elders as kind of a they used what they knew at the time, which was the Jewish synagogue model that was there. So a lot of early church Christians were Jews. And so they would have saw how they had the synagogue model set up with elders presiding over the synagogues and say, well, let's emulate that, but let's do it with Christianity instead. So we're going to set up our own elders to make sure that we can teach those that are below us, that we can also have some sort of pastoral care over those that are below us as well. So we'll just take what we know and we'll create our own kind of version of it within Christianity that's there. And so that's what they did. They basically used the Jewish synagogue model for that to appoint elders over the church. And when I say elders, typically it wasn't just one person that was over a body of believers in a certain town or a certain village or certain city. When I say elders, it was more than one person that was involved in the ministry of the church that was there too. And if you know any history within the Church of the Brethren, that was the same thing with the Church of the Brethren and a lot of early Anabaptist churches at the time as well. Going back to the roots of the Church of the Brethren and Anabaptist churches back into Europe in the 1700s, a lot of congregations had multiple elders, multiple people that would be there, and they would share. And if you think listening to one pastor is enough on Sunday morning, a lot of times they could have 3 or 4 pastors that would share, elders that would share on a Sunday morning, or they would rotate through. So you would have multiple people in charge of the care of the body. And so they also did that same thing too, where they set up multiple elders over so that you'd have a group that was able to hold each other accountable, so to speak, that was there in there. So now it looks a little bit different today. So like I said, I'm not going to try to do too many correlations for today for the time being that's there. Now, the scripture that we read here in 1 Timothy chapter 3, I mentioned that the scripture there uses the word overseer twice. Totally different Greek word than the word elder, the presbyterius elder word. Totally different Greek word that we see for overseer. And you'll recognize this term too. The Greek word here is episkopos. Where have I heard that term before? The Episcopal Church. That is the term for overseer, and basically it simulates that someone is going to be a ruler or a supervisor over a church. Now, this word overseer in the Greek is used in all 3 chapters that we looked at. First Timothy chapter 3 here several times. 1 Peter chapter 5, the verb is actually used there for somebody that's actually providing oversight, and also in Titus chapter 1. So every single passage that we looked at is going to have that term overseer, and then they branch off and say, okay, elder, and then also we look at the other word that we're going to get to here in a second as well too. But this idea of overseer oversaw the spiritual well-being and administrative functions of the Christian community church. That was what happened with the elders as well too. They were involved in teaching, guiding, and protecting the congregation from false teachings and heresies that would pop up from time to time, and they ensured adherence to sound doctrine and also moral conduct as well too. So there was an accountability factor that was put in place as well with these folks. That if you're not walking the walk that you're talking, then we're going to call you out on that and make sure that you are walking straight with what the beliefs that you say that you espouse to that's there. So there was accountability that was a part of being an overseer of the church as well too. And so we'll stop that. I don't want to do too many rabbit trails this morning. My kids like rabbit trails because then we just end up not doing what I think we were going to do, and we wind up taking a 10-minute rabbit trail, and we never actually get to the end of what I was supposed to do. We're not going to get the end of what I want to do this morning if I take too many rabbit trails, so we'll advise not to do that this morning. So anyways, accountability was one of the things that was involved with the overseers, the elders of the church at that time as well. So that was the episkopos, the overseers of the church as well. And the last major term that comes up, and it's primarily in 1 Peter chapter 5, is the idea of a shepherd that's there. 1 Peter chapter 5 refers to the people that are overseeing the church as shepherds because Peter is looking at the idea of the fact that Jesus told him to feed his sheep. So if a person is feeding sheep, they must be a shepherd. And they're emulating what Peter calls the great shepherd or the chief shepherd that's there too. And so leaders are supposed to do that as well. And the word shepherd, the Latin word for shepherd is pastor. That's where we get the word pastor today from the Latin word for shepherd. But it basically is taking care of God's flock. And it's interesting how in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 2, Peter specifically mentions that they are to shepherd God's flock. A leader never sees it as their flock. A leader sees it as God's flock. This is a flock belonging to God and God alone. I am just appointed to take care of it, but it ultimately belongs to Him and Him alone. So whenever we look at that idea of being a steward of what God has given us, we recognize that everything that God has given us is from Him. Nothing has come or originated from me and me alone. I have created nothing. I cannot sustain something that I didn't create without His help. And so the idea here that Peter's getting across in 1 Peter chapter 5 is it is God's flock to take care of. So as you're taking care of this flock, think of it as your service to God that's there. But this idea of shepherd is a little bit more on the blue collar side of things when you think about what a shepherd actually does, because a shepherd was a blue collar person back in the day. They actually weren't very thought highly of in that day and age, other than the fact that they were the people that was supposed to provide the lambs for the sacrifices in the temple. So they weren't thought highly of. So being called a shepherd wasn't necessarily an endearing term that one could take upon. But isn't it interesting how Jesus calls himself the Good Shepherd? Because he was willing to do the hard work that was needed to take care of the flock. And that's basically what Peter refers to here in 1 Peter chapter 5, about being a shepherd, to care, to lead, and to protect the flock. Last week we looked at what the model shepherd looked like when we look at the passage Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. All those things that the shepherd does for the sheep, so does a leader also take care of the flock that God has put him in charge of as well. So he needs to care and feed for the sheep. That involves teaching and preaching the word. Lead them to pasture. Watch out for their spiritual health. Make sure that there's no wolves that are coming in. No wolves that are coming in. Tend to the sheep. Meet the needs. Pray and encourage. A shepherd is supposed to be leading the church to Jesus. Ultimately, it's what the shepherd is doing. It's the job of leaders to point to Jesus as the model, someone that we are all following after to begin with. And so we see the elders, when we look at the idea of elders, overseers, and shepherds, all doing the same thing. It basically boils down to the fact that they teach, they adhere to the core doctrines that's there, and the authority that they have over making decisions, settling disputes. Those are the two main functions that are there. Teaching and ruling over the churches, the bodies that they are a part of. In 1 Timothy here, we see a whole host of qualifications that was expected upon elders. Because if you're going to lead You actually have to have good character as well. Surprisingly, in our day and age today, it seems like anybody can be a leader even if they don't have good moral conduct. If you don't believe me, just go research a couple people that's serving in Congress. You're supposed to laugh at that one. Okay. But here, the qualifications were a little bit more stiffer, a little bit more strict, and expected as well. So we see a whole host here when you go down through. Boy, Paul is he's pretty straightforward here on what type of person it takes to be a leader in the church. Blameless, faithful in their marriage, self-controlled, respectful, hospitable, not a recent convert, firm in the word, able to teach and handle the truth. You have to know your stuff if you're going to teach it to other people as well. And you can't be new to this either, for you might be swayed. It's kind of hard for us to hear today. I tread lightly on this topic because I know that I'm a little bit younger than a lot of folks here in the congregation as well, and it is, I'm honored to be in this position that you have elected me, and I tread lightly on that too, knowing that I want to do the best job that I can to handle the word that's there, knowing that there are many people in this congregation that have quite a few years on me on experience with learning the Bible. So just want to say that there's our rabbit trail for this morning. Continuing on though, sober, gentle, not contentious, not greedy, manages her house well, good reputation, upright and just, encouraging, loves what is good. These are all qualifications that the elders needed. Why? People want a worthy person to follow after. They're not going to follow after somebody that isn't of good moral upright standing, that someone doesn't view very well. It's kind of hard to be a leader if you don't have anybody following you. And so if you don't hold to these qualifications, you might not get very many people to follow you. And so Paul is recognizing that you have to actually do the things that the scriptures say to uphold what God has placed you to do and called you to do in that same time as well. And these things here are nothing outside of what Jesus didn't demonstrate in his own life as well, that we follow after. Let's move on to deacons. 1 Timothy chapter 3, beginning at verse 8, begins to talk about deacons. And it finishes up at verse 13. It says here, deacons likewise are to be